Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're plunging into a really complex and frankly pretty tense situation that you've highlighted for us through these sources.
That's right. We're looking at the dynamic between Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, and Volodymyr Zelensky, especially the recent stuff from early 2025.
Yeah, the attempts at peace talks, the ongoing fighting.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It is. And we've got reports here from the Evening Standard, BBC, AP, Al Jazeera, RNZ, Nidolua Johnson, even the Quincy Institute.
Quite a range.
Definitely. So the aim here is really to pull out the key insights from all these reports, help you understand the players, how things are shifting, and, this whole tangled mess of negotiations and conflict.
And crucially, sticking just to what the sources say, right?
Yeah.
No taking sides.
Exactly. Just laying out the information presented about each leader and their positions as impartially as possible.
Okay, good. So where should we start? Maybe with the immediate context. The sources point to things getting really intense in Ukraine recently.
Yeah, late May 2025. The reports describe these huge Russian aerial attacks, massive scale.
How massive are we talking?
Well, the sources mention, like record numbers. One night, 355 drones and 9 missiles reported. Another night, almost 300 drones, nearly 70 missiles.
Wow.
Ukraine's Air Force apparently called one of them the largest drone attack of the war so far. So, really significant escalation reported.
And the targets, not just military.
No, that's the grim part in these reports. They talk about cities, civilian infrastructure, apartments, even a military hospital in Kharkiv mentioned specifically.
So, inevitably casualties.
Yes, sadly. Deaths and injuries reported, including children. It really paints a picture of, just how brutal things were on the ground then.
Okay, so amidst all that violence, this intense fighting, how did Donald Trump react? The sources seem to pick up on some strong words from him.
They really do. And it's interesting, especially given, his past comments about Putin. The language reported here is sharp.
Like what?
He's quoted calling Putin absolutely crazy, saying something has happened to him. Also that Putin is needlessly killing a lot of people.
Needlessly killing.
Yeah, and shooting rockets into cities for no reason whatsoever. That's a direct quote from one report.
He also said something about if Putin wants all of Ukraine.
Right, that it would lead to the downfall of Russia. Pretty strong warning there. And reports mentioned him considering things like new sanctions, maybe tariffs on Russia in response.
Okay, so strong words for Putin. But, and this is where it gets complicated according to the sources, he wasn't just criticizing Putin, was he?
No, not at all. This is maybe the trickiest part of the dynamic described. At the same time, he was also directing some really sharp criticism towards President Zelensky.
Right. What was he saying about him?
Things like Zelensky is doing his country no favors by talking the way he does, and everything out of his mouth causes problems. I don't like it, and it better stop. Pretty blunt.
And did the reports give specifics? Why was he annoyed with Zelensky?
They did mention a couple of things. One was accusing Zelensky of trying to back out of the rare earth deal.
Which is about minerals, resources.
Presumably, yeah, strategic minerals in Ukraine. That's what the reports seem to suggest. And also accusing Zelensky of pushing for NATO membership, even though Trump apparently claimed Zelensky knew it wasn't going to happen.
And he also drew that line, didn't he? Saying whose war it was.
Yes, explicitly stating it's Zelensky's, Putin's, and former U.S. President Joe Biden's war, not Trump's.
So you've got this picture emerging from the reports of Trump pushing back hard against the Russian attacks, but also simultaneously putting pressure on Kiev.
Exactly. It's this dual-track pressure that really comes through in the reporting from that period. Very complex positioning.
How did the other main players react to all this? What did Moscow say?
Well, the Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, his reaction was reported too. He described Trump's comments about the attacks as emotional overload at this important moment.
Interesting phrasing.
It is. But then Peskov also reportedly thanked the U.S. and Trump personally for their efforts in trying to organize negotiations.
Thank them, even with the crazy comments.
Yeah. Which, according to some source analysis, underlines Moscow's apparent approach at the time.
Yeah.
Trying not to antagonize Trump too much, keeping the door open for talks, perhaps.
Okay. And Ukraine. Zelensky's reaction to the attacks and Trump's comments.
Zelensky, understandably, called the attacks terror. He was quoted saying Putin is demonstrating his contempt for the world, especially a world putting more effort into dialogue than pressure.
He wanted more pressure.
Definitely. He called on the U.S. and Europe specifically to show strength, arguing that silence from America and others just encourages Putin.
Were other Ukrainian voices mentioned?
Yes, an aide was reported accusing Moscow of just stalling the ceasefire talks. And one Ukrainian MP was quoted suggesting Trump might be looking for excuses to avoid sanctions on Russia and maybe shift blame onto Ukraine.
And Europe. Any reaction noted there?
Briefly, yeah. The EU's top diplomat called for the strongest international pressure on Russia. And Germany's foreign minister was reported as saying, quite flatly, that Putin does not want peace.
So, a lot of condemnation of the attacks, but different takes on how to handle the situation, especially regarding Trump's role.
That sums it up well.
Okay, despite all this friction, the fighting, the harsh words, the sources also talk about actual efforts to broker peace, right? The U.S. was involved.
Very much so. Reports indicate the U.S. was actively pushing for some kind of deal to end the war.
Was there a specific proposal mentioned?
Yes, back in March 2025, the U.S. apparently proposed an immediate 30-day ceasefire.
Okay, a 30-day pause. How did that go down?
Well, Ukraine, according to the reports from March 12th, indicated they were willing to accept it.
And Putin?
His response, reported the next day, March 13th, was conditional. He said Russia would agree, but only on his terms.
Which were?
Requiring concessions from Ukraine and insisting any deal had to tackle the root causes, his phrase, which always circles back to things like blocking Ukraine from joining NATO.
So basically, not an immediate, unconditional ceasefire.
Effectively, no. The sources indicate Russia rejected the straightforward 30-day halt unless those demands were met first.
And what was Trump's reported reaction to Putin saying, only on my terms? This was back in March.
Reports from March 14th quote, him expressing hope Russia would do the right thing. He also said it would be a very disappointing moment if they weren't there, sort of implying frustration with their conditional stance.
That theme of frustration, it seems to run through the reports on the peace efforts, doesn't it? Not just from Ukraine, but from the U.S. side, too.
Absolutely. You see it clearly in some of the reported Trump quotes later on as things dragged on and the attacks continued.
Like what?
Well, reports mention him being angry, pissed off when Putin apparently questioned Zelensky's legitimacy as president. He was also quoted saying if they, meaning Russia, presumably are just tapping us along, he will not be happy about it.
Tapping us along, like stringing them along.
Yeah, that seems to be the sense. And when the big attacks hit in May, during these ongoing discussions, he reportedly called it very bad timing, even directed a message like Vladimir, SOP, and said it made him think Putin doesn't want to stop the war, he's just tapping me along. So, yeah, clear frustration reported there.
And there was that Quincy Institute research you mentioned earlier. Did that touch on this frustration?
It did. It noted the Trump administration was reportedly frustrated with both Putin and Zelensky in its efforts.
Both. Interesting.
Yeah. And a key point from that research highlighted in the reports was that bilateral talks alone probably aren't enough. It suggested the real leverage, the incentive and coercive power, rests mainly with Washington.
Makes sense.
But it also stressed, and this is important, that for any peace deal to actually stick, to be durable, it has to consider the stated concerns of all stakeholders. Russia, Ukraine, Europe, everyone's core issues need addressing somehow.
Okay, so that's the recent picture attacks, frustrated talks, complex relationships. To really understand the dynamic now, in early 2025, maybe we should look back a bit. The sources trace the Trump-Zelensky relationship over time.
Yeah, that context is definitely helpful. It didn't start with the war. The reports remind us it goes back to 2019.
When Zelensky was first elected.
Exactly. Trump called to congratulate him. A positive initial call reported in April 2019.
But things got complicated almost immediately, didn't they, with U.S. politics?
They really did. The timing was, well, significant. Just days after that call, Joe Biden announced he was running against Trump. Around the same time, Hunter Biden left the board of Burisma, that Ukrainian energy company.
Ah, right. The whole investigation angle.
Precisely. Sources detail how Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and then Trump himself, reportedly pressed Zelensky to investigate the Bidens. And that whole situation, as we know, led to Trump's first impeachment.
Even though he was ultimately cleared by the Senate.
Right. But the sources suggest those early events may have sown seeds of discontent that lingered in the relationship.
Okay, fast forward to 2022. Russia invades. How did Trump react then, according to reports?
Initially, quite supportive of Ukraine's defense, actually. He was quoted calling the invasion appalling and Zelensky brave, a different tone back then.
Then 2023, he announces he's running again.
Yes, and makes that big promise. He'd have the war settled even before taking office if he won. A very bold claim.
2024, the U.S. election happens. Ukraine's doesn't because of the war. Did they interact?
Sources mention they met, shook hands before the U.S. election. But there was also some friction reported. Zelensky apparently told the New Yorker magazine that he thought Trump doesn't really know how to stop the war.
Ouch. How did Trump take that?
Not well, it seems. He reportedly shot back, saying something like, any deal would have been better, implying Zelensky missed opportunities. But after Trump won the election, reports say they spoke and vowed to work together. A bit of a reset, maybe.
Okay, so that brings us closer to early 2025. How did that year start off between them?
A bit mixed, according to the sources. Zelensky was quoted saying Trump could be decisive in ending the war. And there was a phone call in February reported as being positive.
But then things soured again.
Seems so. Ukraine reportedly wasn't invited to some U.S.-Russia peace talks in February. Then Trump made comments suggesting Ukraine should have never started it, could have made a deal.
And the social media posts.
Right. Reports highlighted Trump calling Zelensky things like a dictator without elections, a modestly successful comedian on Truth Social. And that claim about Ukraine talking the U.S. into spending $350 billion, which sources noted was false.
How did Zelensky respond to that?
He reportedly said Trump was living in a disinformation space and insisted Ukraine was standing strong. So the public rhetoric got pretty heated.
And this reportedly led up to a tense meeting.
Yeah, late February 2025, Zelensky visited the White House. Sources describe this meeting as having aggravated the situation.
What happened?
Reports detail a pretty sharp exchange. One account mentions Senator Vance criticizing Zelensky, asking, have you said thank you once, and calling him disrespectful.
Wow.
And then Trump reportedly raised his voice, accused Zelensky of gambling with the lives of millions and risking World War III, called Zelensky's position very disrespectful to the U.S. efforts.
How did Zelensky react to that?
He reportedly warned that the U.S. would feel it if support wavered. Trump's reported retort was sharp. Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem.
So he left without a deal.
At that moment, yes, according to the reports. Though he did later tweet thanks for U.S. support, trying to smooth things over perhaps.
Yeah.
But clearly a very tense encounter described in those sources.
Okay, so let's try and connect these dots. We've got the recent attacks, the stalled peace talks, this really fraught history between Trump and Zelensky. What's the bigger picture the sources offer?
Well, going back to that Quincy Institute point, reinforced by other reports, U.S. leverage seems key to getting concessions from anyone. Washington holds a lot of the cards, economically and militarily.
But it's not just about U.S. power.
No, exactly. That research and common sense, really, suggests that for any peace to last, it needs buy-in. It has to address the core security concerns of Russia, the sovereignty and security concerns of Ukraine, and the stability concerns of Europe. It's a balancing act.
And looking at the stances reported from Kiev and Moscow, they seem miles apart on how to even start that balancing act.
Completely. From Kiev's perspective, as reported, Russia isn't serious, they're stalling. So the answer is more pressure sanctions, weapons, isolation. Force them to negotiate seriously.
Whereas Moscow?
Moscow's reported actions and statements, especially Peskov thanking Trump amidst criticism, suggests maybe a strategy of managing Trump, playing for time, avoiding those harsher measures while still probing for concessions. Very different approaches described.
The sources also give some background on Putin's views, right? Suggesting this isn't totally new.
Yeah, several reports touch on Putin's long-standing views about Ukraine, its history, its relationship with Russia and the West. The implication in some analysis is that his current actions, while extreme, stem from deeply held beliefs. And perhaps that a lack of a consistently strong international response over the years emboldened him.
Are there any other sort of side details from the sources that add to the picture?
A couple of things worth mentioning briefly. There was a successful prisoner swap reported in May, quite large, 1,000 people exchanged over 3 days after talks involving Turkey. So some channels are still working.
Okay.
Reports also noted ongoing concerns about China supplying equipment, maybe not weapons, but materials to Russian military factories. And Finland summoning Russia's ambassador over airspace violations. Just reminders that this conflict has wider ripples.
Right. So, stepping back from all these details, this deep dive really shows an incredibly complex and, frankly, quite grim picture, doesn't it?
It really does. You have this brutal, ongoing conflict, the recent massive attacks highlighting that. Then you have these peace efforts, pushed by the U.S., but seemingly stuck.
And overlaid on all of that are these incredibly public, often very sharp personal dynamics between the leaders involved, especially as the sources detail between Trump and Zelensky.
That personal friction, the reported frustrations and accusations flying back and forth, it adds another layer of difficulty on top of the already huge geopolitical challenges.
It makes you wonder how you find a path forward when the main players are expressing such divergent views, such distrust, while the fighting just goes on.
Yeah, the sources definitely highlight the immense challenge. There are no easy answers presented here, just a really difficult knot of issues.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to consider, drawing from everything we've unpacked from these reports today.
If a lasting peace deal really does need compromise from all sides, Russia, Ukraine, with the U.S. playing a key role.
And if the sources show the leaders of these key players publicly criticizing each other so harshly, expressing such deep frustration and distrust,
What does that landscape, as reported, tell you about the likely paths forward? And maybe more importantly, what does it tell you about the huge obstacles that still stand in the way of ending this war? Something to think about.